Alright.
I'll supply weird sound effects in the background.
You can if you like.
There'll be a lot of boing.
Well, I mean, if there's an opportunity,
Boing.
you may feel free to do so.
Yeah.
You'll be the mysterious off-camera sound person.
I'm just a sound crew.
Hello, Alex. Hello, Nikolai. It is extremely hot today. I experimented with biking home one-handed with a handful of ice cream cone, and I only ended up with a moderate amount of ice cream on myself.
Not bad.
Yeah. The sounds you hear in the background besides the music are my brother Jesse, who is over for a visit.
Yo!
Maybe providing random sound effects. So if there are random sound effects, I take no responsibility.
Thump.
I've never heard that version of the lark ascending before.
What, you don't like thump?
Fawn Williams, let's get a move on. Well, the lark ascending is just not all that interesting. It's not action-packed.
It's beautiful.
Nikolai says, hello, brother Jesse.
It's like the book, Ben. It takes a while to get going, and it's establishing the
It
shots
does.
for a while.
It's just lovely, but
But then eventually, it starts flowing more into meaning.
I know. Alright, well, despite the fact that it is finally flowing, we're going to get started with the reading. Okay, so in our last session we were reading the Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander. In our last session, Terran and Co. And so Terran, Alonwi, Fleur de Flamme, and Gurgi had been brought by Melangar, who was Gwydian's horse, to the Valley of Medwyn, the hidden Valley of Medwyn, who appears to be wrapped up in all sorts of mystical sort of things, but has healed Gurgi and has given them sort of a safe haven for the time being. And doesn't know where Hen Wen is. So, Oracular Pig still on the lam. Chapter 14, The Black Lake. That night, Medwyn prepared a feast for the travelers. The disorder left by the breakfasting bears had been cleared away. The cottage was neat and snug, though even smaller than Caer Dallben. Terran could see that Medwyn was indeed unused to entertaining human visitors, for his table was barely long enough to seat them all, and for chairs he had been obliged to make do with benches and milking stools. Medwyn sat at the head of the table. The fawn had gone to sleep, but the wolves crouched at his feet and grinned happily. On the back of his chair perched a gigantic golden-plumed eagle, watching every movement with sharp, unblinking eyes. Fluder, although still apprehensive, did not allow his fear to affect his appetite. He ate enough for three without showing the least sign of becoming full. But when he asked for another portion of venison, maybe less sound effects. When he asked for another portion of venison, Medwyn gave a long chuckle and explained to the amazed Fluder that it was not meat at all, but vegetables prepared according to his own recipe. He called it Beyond Meat.
He did not.
No, he didn't. Of course it is, Alami told the bard. You wouldn't expect him to cook his guests, would you? That would be like asking someone to dinner, then roasting them. Really, I think bards are as muddled as assistant pig keepers. Neither one of you seems to think very clearly. As much as he welcomed the food and the chance to rest, Terran was silent throughout the meal, and continued so when he retired to his nest of straw. Until now, he had never imagined Hen Wen might not be alive. He had spoken again with Medwyn, but the old man could give him no reassurance. Wakeful, Terran left the byre and stood outside, looking at the sky. In the clear air, the stars were blue-white, closer than he had ever seen them. He tried to turn his thoughts from Hen Wen. Reaching Caer Dithil was the task he had undertaken, and that in itself would be difficult enough. An owl passed overhead, silent as ashes. The shadow appearing noiselessly beside him was Medwyn.
Not asleep? Medwin asked. A restless night is no way to begin a journey.
It is a journey I'm eager to end, Taran said. There are times when I fear I shall not see Caer Dallben again.
It is not given to men to know the ends of their journeys, Medwin answered. It may be that you will never return to the places dearest to you. But how can that matter if what you must do is here and now?
I think, said Taran longingly, that if I knew I were not to see my own home again, I would be happy to stay in this valley.
Your heart is young and unformed, Medwin said. Yet if I read it well, you are of the few I would welcome here. Indeed, you may stay if you choose. Surely you can entrust your task to your friends.
No, said Taran after a long pause. I have taken it on myself through my own choice.
If that is so, answered Medwin, then you can give it up through your own choice.
From all over the valley it seemed to Taran there came voices urging him to remain. The hemlocks whispered of rest and peace. The lake spoke of sunlight lingering in its depths. The joy of otters at their games. He turned away. No, he said quickly. My decision was made long before this.
Then, Medwin answered gently, so be it.
He put a hand on Taran's brow.
I grant you all that you will allow me to grant, a night's rest. Sleep well.
Taran remembered nothing of returning to the byre or falling asleep, but he rose in the morning sunlight, refreshed and strengthened. Eilonwy and the bard had already finished their breakfast, and Taran was delighted to see that Gurgi had joined them. As Taran approached, Gurgi gave a yelp of joy and turned gleeful somersaults. "Oh, joy!" he cried. "Gurgi is ready for new walkings and stalkings. Oh, yes, and new seekings and peekings. Great lords have been kind to happy, jolly Gurgi." Taran noticed Medwin had not only healed the creature's leg, but he had also given him a bath and a good combing. Gurgi looked only half as twiggy and leafy as usual. In addition, as he saddled Mellingar, Taran found that Medwin had packed the saddlebags with food, and had included warm cloaks for all of them. The old man called the travellers around him, and seated himself on the ground. "Hello, Catherine."
The armies of the Horned King are by now a day's march ahead of you, he said. But if you follow the paths I shall reveal, and move quickly, you may regain the time you have lost. It is even possible for you to reach Caer Dithil a day, perhaps 2 before them. However, I warn you, the mountain ways are not easy. If you prefer, I shall set you on a path toward the Valley of Estrad once again.
Then we would be following the Horned King, Taran said. There would be less chance of overtaking him, and much danger, too. Apparently, eating 2 scoops of ice cream before reading makes you somewhat phlegmy.
Yep.
Do not think the mountains are not dangerous, Medwin said, though it is danger of a different sort.
A flam thrives on danger, cried the bard. Let it be the mountains or the Horned King's host. I fear neither, not to any great extent, he added quickly. We shall risk the mountains, Taran said. For once, Eilonwy interrupted, you've decided the right thing. The mountains certainly aren't going to throw spears at us, no matter how dangerous they are. I really think you're improving.
Listen carefully, then, Medwin ordered.
As he spoke, his hands moved deftly in the soft earth before him, moulding a tiny model of hills, which Taran found easier to follow than Fflewddir's map scratchings. When he finished, and the traveller's gear and weapons were secured on Mellingar's back, Medwin led the group from the valley. As closely as Taran observed each step of the way, he knew that the path to Medwin's valley would be lost to him as soon as the ancient man left. In a little while, Medwin stopped.
Your path now lies to the north, he said, and here we shall part, and you, Taran of Caer Dallben, whether you have chosen wisely, you will learn from your own heart. Perhaps we shall meet again, and you will tell me. Until then, farewell.
Before Taran could turn and thank Medwin, the white-bearded man disappeared, as if the hills had swallowed him up, and the travellers stood by themselves on a rocky, wind-swept plateau. Well, said Fflewddir, hitching up the harp behind him, I somehow feel that if we meet any more wolves, they'll know we're friends of Medwin. The first day's march was less difficult than Taran had feared, and they were out of the windy plateau. This time he led the way, for the bard admitted, after a number of harp strings had snapped, that he had not been able to keep all Medwin's directions in his head. They climbed steadily until long after the sun had turned westward, and though the ground was rough and broken, the path Medwin had indicated lay clearly before them. Mountain streams, whose water ran cold and clear, made winding lines of sparkling silver as they danced down the slopes into the distant valley lands. The air was bracing, yet with a cold edge which made the travellers grateful for the cloaks Medwin had given them. At a long cleft protected from the wind, Taran signalled a halt. They had made excellent progress during the day, far more than he had expected, and he saw no reason to exhaust themselves by forcing a march during the night. Tethering Mellingar to one of the stunted trees that grew in the heights, the travellers made camp. Since there was no further danger from the Cauldron-born, and the hosts of the Horned King moved far below and to the west of the group, Taran deemed it safe to build a fire. Medwin's provisions needed no cooking, but the blaze warmed and cheered them. As the night shadows drifted from the peaks, Elanwi lit her golden sphere and set it in the crevice of a faulted rock. Gurgi, who had not uttered a single moan or groan during this part of the journey, perched on a boulder and began scratching himself luxuriously, although, after Medwin's washing and combing, it was more through habit than anything else. The bard, as lean as ever, despite the huge amount he had eaten, repaired his harp strings. "You've been carrying that harp ever since I met you," Elanwi said, "and you've never once played it. That's like telling somebody you want to talk to them, and when they get ready to listen, you don't say anything."
"You'd hardly expect me to go strumming out airs while those Cauldron warriors were following us," Fludra said.
"Somehow I didn't think it would be appropriate. But a flam is always obliging, so if you really care to hear me play," he added, looking both delighted and embarrassed. He cradled the instrument in one arm, and almost before his fingers touched the strings, a gentle melody, as beautiful as the curve of the harp itself, lifted like a voice, singing without words. What a nice, gentle melody. It's a bit of an aimless melody. To Taran's ear, the melody had its own words, weaving a supple thread among the rising notes. "Home, home," they sang, and beyond the words themselves, so fleeting he could not be quite sure of them, were the fields and orchards of Caer Dallben, the gold afternoons of autumn and the crisp winter mornings with pink sunlight on the snow. Then the harp fell silent. Fludra sat with his head bent close to the strings, a curious expression on his long face. "Well, that was a surprise," said the bard at last. "I had planned something a little more lively, the sort of thing my war leader always enjoys, to put us in a bold frame of mind, you understand. The truth of the matter is," he admitted with a slight tone of discouragement, "I don't really know what's going to come out of it next. My fingers go along, but sometimes I think this harp plays of itself. Perhaps," Fludra continued, "that's why Taliesin thought he was doing me a favour when he gave it to me. Because when I went up to the Council of Bards for my examination, I had an old pot one of the minstrels had left behind, and I couldn't do more than plunk out a few chants. However, a flam never looks a gift horse in the mouth, or in this case, I should say, harp."
"It was a sad tune," Elanwi said, "but the odd thing about it is, you don't mind the sadness. It's like feeling better after you've had a good cry. It made me think of the sea again, though I haven't been there since I was a little girl."
At this, Taran snorted, but Elanwi paid no attention to him.
"The waves break against the cliffs and churn into foam, and farther out, as far as you can see, there are white crests, the white horses of Lear, they call them, but they're really only waves waiting their turn to roll in."
"Strange," said the bard. "Personally, I was thinking of my own castle. It's small and drafty, but I would like to see it again. A person can't have enough wandering, you know. It made me think I might even settle down again and try to be a respectable sort of a king."
"Caer Dallben is close to my heart," Taran said. "When I left, I never gave it too much thought. Now I think of it a great deal."
Gurgi, who had been listening silently, set up a long howl. "Yes, yes, soon great warriors will all be back in their halls, telling their tales with laughings and chaffings. Then it will be the fearful forest again for poor Gurgi to put down his tender head in snoozings and snorings."
"Gurgi," Taran said, I promise to bring you to Cair Dalbin if I ever get there myself. And if you like it, and if Dalbin agrees, you can stay there as long as you want." "What joy!" Gurgi cried. "Honest, toiling Gurgi extends thanks and best wishes. Oh yes, fond, obedient Gurgi will work hard." "For now, obedient Gurgi had better sleep," Taran advised. "And so should we all. Medwin has put us well on our way, and it can't take much longer. We'll start again at daybreak." During the night, however, a gale arose, and by morning a drenching rain beat into the cleft. Instead of slackening, the wind gained in force and screamed over the rocks. It beat like a fist against the traveller's shelter, then pried with searching fingers, as if to seize and dash them into the valley. As a side note, you haven't yet, but in case you get too enthusiastic with the sound effects, there's a baby who is upstairs. I didn't think you would, but forewarning, just in case. Sound effects by Jesse Brooke, special effects. They set out nevertheless, holding their cloaks before their faces. To make matters worse, the path broke off entirely, and sheer cliffs loomed ahead of them. The rain stopped, after the travellers had all been soaked to the skin, but now the rocks were slippery and treacherous. Even the sure-footed Melangar stumbled once, and for a breathless moment Taran feared she would be lost. The mountains swung a half-circle around a lake black and sullen below threatening clouds. Taran halted on an outcropping of stone, and pointed towards the hills at the far side of the lake. "According to what Medwin told us," he said to the bard, "we should make for that notch all the way over there. But I see no purpose in following the mountains when we can cut almost straight across. The lake shore is flat, at least, while here it's getting practically impossible to climb." Fluter rubbed his pointed nose. "Even counting the time it would take us to go down and come up again, I think we should save several hours. Yes, I believe it's definitely worth trying." "Medwin didn't say a word about crossing valleys," Elanwi put in. "He didn't say anything about cliffs like these," answered Taran. "They seem nothing to him. He's lived here a long time. For us, it's something else again." "If you don't listen to what somebody tells you," Elanwi remarked, "it's like putting your fingers in your ears and jumping down a well. For an assistant pig keeper who's done very little travelling, you suddenly know all about it." "Who found the way out of the barrow?" Taran retorted. "It's decided. We cross the valley." The descent was laborious, but once they had reached ground level, Taran felt all the more convinced they would save time. Holding Melangar's bridle, he led the group along the narrow shore. The lake reached closely to the base of the hills, obliging Taran to splash through the shallows. The lake, he realized, was not black in reflection of the sky. The water itself was dark, flat, and as grim and heavy as iron. The bottom, too, was as treacherous as the rocks above. Despite his care, Taran lurched and nearly got a ducking. When he turned to warn the others, to his surprise he saw Gurgi in water up to his waist, and heading towards the center of the lake. Fluter and Elanwi were also splashing further and further from land. "Don't go through the water," Taran called. "Keep to the shore." "Wish we could," the bard shouted back. "But we're stuck somehow. There's a terribly strong pull." A moment later, Taran understood what the bard meant. An unexpected swell knocked him off his feet, and even as he put out his hands to break his fall, the black lake sucked him down. Beside him, Melangar thrashed her legs and whinnied. The sky spun overhead. He was pulled along like a twig in a torrent. Elanwi shot past him. He tried to regain his footing and catch her. It was too late. He skimmed and bobbed over the surface. The far shore would stop them, Taran thought, struggling to keep his head above of the waves. A roar filled his ears. The middle of the lake was a whirlpool, clutching and flinging him to the depths. Black water closed over him, and he knew he was drowning. Down he spun, battling for air, in a flood that broke upon him like a crumbling mountain. Faster and faster the waters bore him along, tossing him right and left. Taran collided with something. What it was, he couldn't tell, but he clung to it even as his strength failed him. There was a crash, as though the earth had split asunder. The water turned to foam, and Taran felt himself dashed against an unyielding wall. He remembered nothing more. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on a hard, smooth surface, his hands tightly gripping Fluter's harp. He heard the rush of water close by. Cautiously he felt around him. His fingers touched only wet, flat stone, an embankment of some kind. This is a much windier reading than usual.
There's wind everywhere.
Well, there's wind and water.
His fingers touched only wet, flat stone, an embankment of some kind. A pale blue light shone high above him. Taran decided he had come to rest in a cave or grotto. He raised himself and his movement set the harp to jangling.
Right.
"Hello! Who's that?" A voice echoed down the embankment. Faint though it was, Taran recognized it as belonging to the bard. He scrambled to his feet and crept in the direction of the sound. On the way he tripped over a form, which became suddenly vocal and indignant. "You've done very well, Taran of Caer Dallben, with all your shortcuts. What's left of me is soaked to the skin, and I can't find my bauble. Oh, here it is. All wet, of course, and who knows what's happened to the rest of us?" The golden light flared dimly to reveal the dripping face of Eilonwy, her blue eyes flashing with vexation. Gurgi's hairy, spluttering shadow rolled toward them. "Oh, poor tender head is filled with sloshings and washings." In another moment, Fflewddur had found them. Melingar whinnied behind him. "I thought I heard my harp down here," he said. "I couldn't believe it at first. Never expected to see it again. But a flam never despairs. Quite a stroke of luck, though." "I never thought I'd see anything again," Taran said, handing the instrument to Fflewddur. "We've been washed into a cave of some kind, but it's not a natural one. Look at these flagstones." "If you'd look at Melingar," Eilonwy called, "you'd see all our provisions are gone. All our weapons, too, thanks to your precious shortcut." It was true. The straps had broken loose and the saddle had torn away in the whirlpool. Luckily, the companions still had their swords. "I'm sorry," Taran said. "I admit we are here through my fault. I should not have followed this path, but what's done is done. I led us here, and I'll find a way out." He glanced around. The roar of water came from a wide, swift-running canal. The embankment itself was much broader than he had realized. Lights of various colors glowed in the high arches. He turned to his companions again. "This is very curious. We seem to be deep underground, but it isn't the lake bottom." Before he could utter another word, he was seized from behind, and a bag smelling strongly of onions was jammed over his head. Eilonwy screamed, then her voice grew muffled. Taran was being half pushed, half pulled in two directions at once. Gurgi began yelping furiously. "Here, get that one," a gruff voice shouted. "Get him yourself, can't you see I've got my hands full?" Taran struck out. A solid round ball that must have been someone's head butted him in the stomach. There were slapping noises filtering through the oniony darkness around him. Though those would be from Eilonwy. Now he was pushed from behind, propelled at top speed, while angry voices shouted at him and at each other. "Hustle along there! You fool, you didn't take their swords!" At this came another shriek from Eilonwy, the sound of what might have been a kick, then a moment of silence. "All right, let them keep their swords. You'll have the blame of it, letting them approach King Edeleg with weapons." At a blind trot, Taran was shoved through what seemed a large crowd of people. Everyone was talking at once. The noise was deafening. After a number of turns, he was thrust forward again. A heavy door snapped behind him. The onion bag was snatched from his head. Taran blinked. With Fflewddur and Eilonwy, he stood in the center of a high-vaulted chamber, glittering with lights. Gurgi was nowhere in sight. Their captors were half a dozen squat, round, stubby-legged warriors. Axes hung from their belts, and each man had a bow and quiver of arrows on his shoulder. The left eye of the short, burly fellow who stood beside Eilonwy was turning greenish-black. Before them, at a long stone table, a dwarfish figure with a bristling yellow beard glared at the warriors. He wore a robe of garish red and green. Rings sparkled on his plump fingers. "What's this?" he shouted. "Who are these people? Didn't I give orders I wasn't to be disturbed?" "But, Majesty," began one of the warriors, shifting uneasily, "we caught them." "Must you bother me with details?" King Edeleg cried, clasping his forehead. "You'll ruin me. You'll be the death of me. Out! Out! No, not the prisoners, you idiots!" Shaking his head, sighing and sputtering, the king collapsed onto a throne carved from rock. The guards scurried away. King Edeleg shot a furious glance at Taran and his companions. "Now then, out with it! What do you want? You might as well know ahead of time you shan't have it." "Sire," Taran began, "we ask no more than safe passage through your realm. The four of us—" "There's only 3 of you," King Edeleg snapped. "Can't you count?" "One of my companions is missing."
Terran said regretfully. He had hoped Gurgi would have overcome his fear, but he could not blame the creature for running off after his ordeal in the whirlpool. I beg your servants to help us find him. Then, too, our provisions and weapons have been lost.
That's clotted nonsense, shouted the king. Don't lie to me, I can't stand it.
He pulled an orange kerchief from his sleeve and mopped his forehead.
Why did you come here?
Because an assistant pig keeper led us on a wild goose chase.
Eilonwy interrupted.
We don't even know where we are, let alone why. It's worse than rolling downhill in the dark.
Naturally,
said Edeleg, his voice dripping with sarcasm.
You have no idea you're in the very heart of the kingdom of the Tilwyth Teg, the fair folk, the happy family, the little people, or whatever other insipid, irritating names you put on us. Oh no, of course not. You just happened to be passing by.
We were caught in the lake, Terran protested.
It pulled us down. Good, eh?
King Edeleg answered, with a quick smile of pride.
I've added some improvements of my own, of course.
If you're so anxious to keep visitors away,
Eilonwy said,
you should have something better to make people stay out.
When people get this close,
Edeleg answered,
they're already too close. At that point, I don't want them out, I want them in.
Fflewddur shook his head.
I always understood the fair folk were all over Brittain, not just here. Of course not just here, said Edeleg with impatience. This is the royal seat. Why, we have tunnels and mines every place you can imagine. But the real work, the real labour of organisation is here, right here in this very spot, in this very throne room, on my shoulders. It's too much, I tell you, too much. But who else can you trust? If you want something done right...
The king stopped suddenly and drummed his glittering fingers on the stone table.
That's not your affair, he said. You're in trouble enough as it is. It can't be overlooked.
I don't see any work being done,
said Eilonwy.
Before Terran could warn Eilonwy not to be imprudent, the door of the throne room burst open and a crowd of folk pressed in.
Looking closer, Terran saw not all were dwarves. Some were tall, slender, with white robes.
Others were covered with glistening scales like fish. Still others fluttered large, delicate wings. For some moments Terran heard nothing but a confusion of voices, angry outcries and bickering, with Edeleg trying to shout above them. Finally the king managed to push them all out again. No work being done, he cried. You don't appreciate everything that goes into it. The children evening, that's another ridiculous name you humans have thought up, are to sing in the forest of Cantref Mawr tonight. They haven't even practiced. 2 are sick and 1 can't be found. The lake sprites have been quarrelling all day. Now they're sulking. Their hair's a mess. And who does that reflect on? Who has to jolly them along? Coax them, plead with them. The answer is obvious. What thanks do I get for it? King Edeleg ranted on. None at all. Has any of you long-legged gawks ever taken the trouble, even once mind you, to offer the simplest expression of gratitude, such as, Thank you, King Edeleg, for the tremendous effort and inconvenience you've gone to, so that we can enjoy a little charm and beauty in the world above, which would be so unspeakably grim without you and your fair folk. Just a few words of honest appreciation? But no, by no means, just the opposite. If any of you thick-skulled oafs come on one of the fair folk above ground, what happens? You seize him, you grab him with your great hammy hands and try to make him lead you to buried treasure. Or you squeeze him until you get 3 wishes out of him, not satisfied with 1, oh no, but 3. Well, I don't mind telling you this, Edeleg went on, his face turning redder by the moment. I've put an end to all this wish-granting and treasure scavenging. No more, absolutely not. I'm surprised you didn't ruin us long ago.
Just then a chorus of voices rose from behind the door of Edeleg's throne room. The harmonies penetrated even the walls of heavy stone. Terran had never in his life heard such beautiful singing. He listened enchanted, forgetting for the moment all but the soaring melody. Edeleg himself stopped shouting and puffing until the voices died away.
That's something to be thankful for, the king said at last. The children of evening have evidently got together again. Not as good as you might want, but they'll manage somehow.
I've not heard the songs of the fair folk until now, Terran said. I'd never realized how lovely they were.
Don't try to flatter me,
Edeleg cried, trying to look furious, yet beaming at the same time.
What surprises me,
Eilonwy said, while the bard plucked meditatively at his harp, trying to recapture the notes of the song,
is why you go to so much trouble. If you fair folk dislike all of us above ground, why do you bother?
Professional pride, my dear girl, said the Dwarf King, putting a chubby hand to his heart and bowing slightly. When we fair folk do something, we do it right. Oh, yes, he sighed. Never mind the sacrifices we make. It's a task that needs doing, so we do it. Never mind the cost. For myself, he added, with a wave of his hand, it doesn't matter. I've lost sleep, I've lost weight, but that's not important. If King Edeleg had lost weight, Taran thought to himself, what must he have been like beforehand? He decided against asking this question.
Well, I appreciate it,
Eilonwy said.
I think it's amazing what you've been able to do. You must be extremely clever, and any assistant pig keepers who happen to be in his throne room might do well to pay attention.
Thank you, dear girl, said King Edeleg, bowing lower. I see you're the sort of person one can talk to intelligently. It's unheard of for one of you big shambling louts to have any kind of insight into these matters, but you at least seem to understand the problems we face.
Sire, interrupted Taran, we understand your time is precious. Let us disturb you no more. Give us safe conduct to Caer Dithil.
What? Shouted Edeleg. Leave here? Impossible! Unheard of! Once you're with the fair folk, my good lad, you stay, and no mistake about it. Oh, I suppose I could stretch a point for the sake of the young lady, and let you off easily, only put you to sleep for 50 years, or turn you all into bats. But that would be a pure favour, mind you.
A task is urgent, Taran cried. Even now we have delayed too long.
That's your concern, not mine,
Edeleg shrugged.
Then we shall make our own way,
Taran shouted,
drawing his sword. Fflewddir's blade leapt out, and the bard stood with Taran, ready to fight. More clotted nonsense,
King Edeleg said, looking contemptuously at the swords pointed toward him.
He shook his fingers at them. There, and there. Now you might try to move your arms.
Taran strained every muscle. His body felt turned to stone.
Put your swords away, and let's talk this over calmly,
said the Dwarf King,
gesturing again. If you give me any decent reason why I should let you go, I might think it over and answer you promptly, say, in a year or two.
There could be no use, Taran saw, in concealing the reasons for his journey. He explained to Edeleg what had befallen them. The Dwarf King ceased his blustering at the mention of Iran, but when Taran had finished, King Edeleg shook his head.
This is a conflict you great gawks must attend to yourself. The fair folk owe you no allegiance, he said angrily. Prydain belonged to us before the race of men came. You drove us underground. You plundered our mines, you blundering clodpoles. You stole our treasures, and you keep on stealing them, you clumsy oafs.
Sire, Taran answered, I can speak for no man but myself. I have never robbed you, and I have no wish to. My task means more to me than your treasures. If there is ill will between the fair folk and the race of men, then it is a matter to be settled between them. But if the Horned King triumphs, if the shadow of Anabin falls on the land above you, Iran's hand will reach your deepest caverns.
For an assistant pig keeper,
said Edeleg,
you're reasonably eloquent. But the fair folk will worry about Iran when the time comes.
The time has come, Taran said. I only hope it has not passed. I don't think you really know what's going on above ground, Eilonwy suddenly exclaimed. You talk about charm and beauty and sacrificing yourself to make things pleasant for people. I don't believe you care a bit for that. You're too conceited and stubborn and selfish.
Conceited?
shouted Edeleg, his eyes popping.
Selfish? You won't find anyone more open-hearted and generous. How dare you say that? What do you want? My life's blood? With that he tore off his cloak and threw it in the air, pulled the rings from his fingers and tossed them in every direction. Go ahead, take it all, leave me ruined. What else do you want? My whole kingdom? Do you want me to leave? Do you want to leave? Go, by all means. The sooner the better. Stubborn? I'm too soft. It'll be the death of me. But little you care.
At that moment, the door of the throne room burst open again. Two dwarf warriors clung frantically to Gurgi, who swung them about as if they were rabbits.
Joyous greetings! Faithful Gurgi is back with mighty heroes. This time valiant Gurgi did not run. Oh, no, no! Brave Gurgi fought with great whackings and smackings. He triumphed. But then mighty lords are carried away. Clever Gurgi goes seeking and peeking to save them, yes, and he finds them. But that is not all. Ooh, faithful, honest, fearless Gurgi finds more. Surprises and delights. Oh, joy!
Gurgi was so excited that he began dancing on one foot, spinning around and clapping his hands.
Mighty warriors go to seek a piggy. It is clever, wise Gurgi who finds her.
Hen Wen? Cried Terran. Where is she?
Here, mighty lord,
Gurgi shouted.
the piggy is here. Chapter 16, Doli.
Terran turned accusingly to King Adelag. You said nothing of Hen Wen.
You didn't ask me,
said Adelag.
That's sharp practice, Fluder muttered, even for a king.
It's worse than a lie, Terran said angrily. You'd have let us go our way and we'd have never known what happened to her. You should be ashamed of yourself, Eilonwy put in, shaking her finger at the king, who appeared most embarrassed at being found out. It's like looking the other way when someone's about to walk into a hole.
Finders keepers, the dwarf king snapped. A troop of the fair folk came on her near the Avon banks. She was running through a ravine, and I'll tell you something you don't know. Half a dozen warriors were after her, the henchmen of the Horned King. The troop took care of those warriors. We have our own ways of dealing with you clumsy lummoxes, and they brought your pig here, underground most of the way.
No wonder Gwydion could find no tracks, Terran murmured to himself.
The fair folk rescued her,
Adelag angrily continued, turning bright red.
and there's another fine example. Do I get a word of thanks? Naturally not. But do I get called disagreeable names and have nasty thoughts thrown at me? Oh, I can see it in your faces. Adelag is a thief and a wretch. That's what you're saying to yourselves. Well, just for that you shan't have her back, and you'll stay here, all of you, until I feel like letting you go.
Eilonwy gasped with indignation. If you do that, she cried, you are a thief and a wretch. You gave me your word. The fair folk don't go back on their word.
There was no mention of a pig, no mention at all.
Adelag clapped his hands over his belly and snapped his mouth shut. No, Terran said, there was not, but there is a question of honesty and honour. Adelag blinked and looked sideways. He took out his orange kerchief and mopped his brow again.
Honour, he muttered. Yes, I was afraid you'd come to that. True, the fair folk never break their word. Well, he sighed, that's the price for being open-hearted and generous. So be it, you shall have your pig.
We shall need weapons to replace those we lost, Terran said.
What? Screamed Adelag. Are you trying to ruin me? And crunchings and munchings,
piped up Gurgi. Terran nodded. Provisions as well.
This is going too far, Adelag shouted. You're bleeding me to death. Weapons, food, pigs.
And we beg for a guide who will show us the way to Caer At this, Adelag nearly exploded. When he finally calmed himself, he nodded reluctantly.
I shall lend you Doli, he said. He is the only one I can spare.
He clapped his hands and gave orders to the armed dwarfs, then turned to the companions.
Off with you now, before I change my mind.
Eilonwy stepped quickly to the throne, bent and kissed Adelag on the top of his head. Thank you, she whispered. You're a perfectly lovely king.
Out, out, the dwarf cried. As the stone door closed behind him, Terran saw King Adelag patting his head and beaming happily.
The troop of fair folk led the company down the vaulted corridors. Terran had at first imagined Adelag's realm to be no more than a maze of underground galleries. To his astonishment, the corridors soon broadened into wide avenues. In the great domes far overhead, gems glittered,
Clem's jittered,
as bright as sunshine. There was no grass, but deep carpets of green lichen stretched out like meadows. There were blue lakes, glistening as much as the jewels above, and cottages and small farmhouses. It was difficult for Terran and his companions to realize they were underground.
I've been thinking, whispered Fluder, that it might be wiser to leave Hen Wen here until we can return for her.
I thought of that too, answered Terran. It's not that I don't trust Adelag to keep his word, most of the time, but I'm not sure we should take another chance in that lake, and I doubt we could find another way into his kingdom. He certainly won't make it easy for us to come back, I'm afraid. No, we must take Hen Wen while we have the chance. Once she's with me again, I won't let her out of my sight. Suddenly the fair folk halted at one of the cottages, and from a nearby carpentered pen, Terran heard a loud "Oink!" He raced to the sty. Hen Wen was standing with her front feet on the rails, grunting at the top of her voice. One of the fair folk opened the gate, and the white pig burst out, wriggling and squealing. Terran threw his arms around Hen Wen's neck. "Oh, Hen," he cried, "even Medwyn thought you were dead."
Hen Wen chuckled joyfully. Her beady eyes sparkled. Yes. With her great pink snout, she rootled affectionately under Terran's chin, and came close to knocking him down. She looks like a wonderful pig, Elanwi said, scratching Hen Wen behind the ears. It's always nice to see two friends meet again. It's like waking up with the sun shining. She certainly is a great deal of pig, agreed the bard, though very handsome, I must say. And clever, noble, brave, wise Gurgi found her. Have no fear, Terran said, with a smile to Gurgi. There's no chance we'll forget it. Rolling and waddling on her short legs, Hen Wen followed Terran happily, while the fair folk proceeded across the fields to where a stocky figure waited. The captain of the troop announced that this was Doli, the guide Edelig had promised. Doli, short and stumpy, almost as broad as he was tall, wore a rust-colored leather jacket and stout knee-high boots. A round cap covered his head, but not enough to conceal a fringe of flaming red hair. An axe and a short sword hung from his belt, and over his shoulder he wore the stubby bow of the fair folk warrior. Terran bowed politely. The dwarf stared at him with a pair of bright red eyes and snorted. Then, to Terran's surprise, Doli took a deep breath and held it until his face turned scarlet and he looked about to burst. After a few moments, the dwarf puffed out his cheeks and snorted again. "What's the trouble?" asked Terran. "You can still see me, can't you?" Doli burst out angrily. "Of course I can still see you," Terran frowned. "Why shouldn't I?" Doli gave him a scornful look and did not answer. Two of the fair folk led up Melangar. King Edeleg, Terran saw with relief, was as good as his word. The saddlebags bulged with provisions, and the white mare also carried a number of spears, bows, and arrows, short and heavy, as were all the weapons of the fair folk, but carefully and sturdily crafted. Without another word, Doli beckoned them to follow him across the meadow, grumbling and muttering to himself. The dwarf led them to what seemed to be the sheer face of a cliff. Only after he had reached it did Terran see long flights of steps carved into the living rock. Doli jerked his head toward the stairway, and they began to climb. This passageway of the fair folk was steeper than any of the mountains they had crossed. Melangar strained forward. Wheezing and gasping, Hen Wen pulled herself up each step laboriously. The stairway turned and twisted. At one part the darkness was such that the companions lost sight of each other. After a time the steps broke off, and the group trod a narrow pathway of hard-packed stones. Sheets of white light rippled ahead, and the travellers found themselves behind a high waterfall. One after the other, they leapt the glistening rocks, splashed through a foaming stream, and at last emerged into the cool air of the hills. Doli squinted up at the sun. "Not much daylight left," he muttered, more gruffly than King Edeleg himself. "Don't think I'm going to walk my legs off all night either. Didn't ask for this work, you know. Got picked for it. Guiding a crew of what? An assistant pig keeper? A yellow-headed idiot with a harp? A girl with a sword? A shaggy what's-it? Not to mention the livestock. All you can hope for is you don't run into a real war band. They'd do for you, they would. There's not one of you looks as if he could handle a blade." This was the most Doli had spoken since they had left Edeleg's realm, and despite the dwarves' uncomplimentary opinions, Terran hoped he would finally come around to being civil. Doli, however, had said all he intended to say for a while. Later, when Terran ventured to speak to him, the dwarf turned angrily away and started holding his breath again. "For goodness sake," Elanwi cried, "I wish you'd stop that. It makes me feel as if I'd drunk too much water just watching you." "It still doesn't work," Doli growled. "What are you trying to do?" Terran asked. Even Hen Wen stared curiously at the dwarf. "What does it look like?" Doli answered. "I'm trying to make myself invisible." "It's an odd thing to attempt," remarked Fuder. "I'm supposed to be invisible," snapped Doli. "My whole family can do it, just like that, like blowing out a candle. But not me. No wonder they all laugh at me. No wonder Edeleg sends me out with a pack of fools. If there's anything nasty or disagreeable to be done, it's always find good old Doli. If there's gems to be cut, or blades to be decorated, or arrows to be footed. That's the job for good old Dolly." The dwarf held his breath again, this time so long that his face turned blue and his ears trembled.
"I think you're getting it now," the bard said with an encouraging smile.
"I can't see you at all." No sooner had this remark passed his lips than a harp string snapped in two. Fluter looked sorrowfully at the instrument. "Blast the thing," he muttered. "I knew I was exaggerating somewhat. I only did it to make him feel better. He actually did seem to be fading a bit around the edges."
"If I could carve gems and do all those other things," Taran remarked sympathetically to Dolly, "I wouldn't mind not being invisible. All I know is vegetables and horseshoes, and not too much about either."
"Hello, Katya." "Excellent. Catch up before tomorrow. Tomorrow we're finishing. So yes, do come back tomorrow. I'll post it on Instagram afterwards and then on YouTube as well. And on Facebook. So you have options. And we'll see you tomorrow, Katya."
It's silly, Elanwi added, to worry because you can't do something you simply can't do. That's worse than trying to make yourself taller by standing on your head.
None of these well-intentioned remarks cheered the dwarf, who strode angrily ahead, swinging his axe from side to side. Despite his bad temper, Dolly was an excellent guide, Taran realized. Most of the time the dwarf said little beyond his usual grunts and snorts, making no attempt to explain the path he followed or to suggest how long it would take the companions to reach Caer Dithil. Taran, nevertheless, had learned a great deal of woodcraft and tracking during his journey, and he was aware that the companions had begun turning westward to descend the hills. They had, during the afternoon, covered more ground than Taran thought possible, and he knew it was thanks to Dolly's expert guidance. When he congratulated the dwarf, Dolly answered only, "Hmm," and held his breath. They camped that night on the sheltered slope of the last barrier mountains. Gurgi, whom Taran had taught to build a fire, was delighted to be useful. He cheerfully gathered twigs, dug a cooking pit, and to the surprise of all, distributed the provisions equally, without saving out a private share for his own crunchings and munchings later on. Dolly refused to do anything whatsoever. He took his own food from a large leather wallet hanging at his side, and sat on a rock, chewing glumly. He snorted with annoyance between every mouthful, and occasionally held his breath. "Keep at it, old boy," called Fluter. "Another try might do it. Your outline looks definitely blurred."
"Oh, hush," Elanwi told the bard. "Don't encourage him, or he'll decide to hold his breath forever."
"Just lending support," explained the crestfallen bard. "A Flam never gives up, and I don't see why a dwarf should." Hen Wen had not left Taran's side all day. Now, as he spread his cloak on the ground, the white pig grunted with pleasure, waddled over and hunkered down beside him. Her crinkled ears relaxed. She thrust her snout comfortably against Taran's shoulder and chuckled contentedly, a blissful smile on her face. Soon the whole weight of her head pressed on him, making it impossible for Taran to roll onto his side. Hen Wen snored luxuriously, and Taran resigned himself to sleeping, despite the assortment of whistles and groans directly below his ear. "I'm glad to see you, Hen," he said, "and I'm glad you're glad to see me, but I wish you wouldn't be so loud about it." Next morning they turned their backs on the Eagle Mountains, and began heading for what Taran hoped would be Caer Dithil. As the trees rose more densely around them, Taran turned for a last glimpse of the eagle itself, tall and serene in the distance. He was grateful their path had not led them over it, but in his heart he hoped one day to return and climb its towers of sun-flecked ice and black stone. Until this journey he had never seen mountains, but now he understood why Gwydion had spoken longingly of Caer Dithil. His thought led Taran to wonder again what else Gwydion had expected to learn from Hen Wen. When they halted, he spoke to Fluter about it. "There may be someone in Caer Dithil who can understand her," Taran said. "But if we could only get her to prophesy now, she might tell us something important." The bard agreed. However, as Taran had pointed out, they had no letter sticks. "I could try a new spell," offered Elanwi. "Aughrin taught me some others, but I don't know if they'd be any use. They haven't anything to do with oracular pigs. I do know a wonderful one for summoning toads. Aughrin was about to teach me the spell for opening locks, but I don't suppose I'll ever learn it now. Even so, locks haven't much to do with pigs either."
Eilonwy knelt beside Hen Wen and whispered rapidly. Hen Wen seemed to listen politely for a while, grinning broadly, wheezing and snuffling. She gave no sign of understanding a word of what the girl was saying, and at last, with a joyful she broke away and ran to Terran, wriggling gleefully. "It's no use," Terran said, "and there's no sense in losing time. I hope they have letter sticks in Caer Dithil, though I doubt it. Whatever Dolben has, it seems to be the only one of its kind in all Prydain." They resumed their march. Gurgi, now official cook and firemaker, strolled boldly behind the dwarf. Doli led the companions through a clearing and past a line of alders. A few moments later, the dwarf halted and cocked his head. Terran heard the sound too, a faint, high-pitched screaming. It seemed to come from a twisted thorn bush. Drawing his sword, Terran hurried past the dwarf. At first he could see nothing in the dark tangle. He drew closer, then stopped abruptly. It was a Gwythaint. And there we will end it for the day. Tomorrow we will finish off. We should be able to finish off in about the same amount of time. We have 3 or maybe 4 chapters left. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you've enjoyed yourselves. And we'll see you tomorrow at 8:30. See you then. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you tomorrow.